Well, good evening, class. I wanted to talk to you in the time I have um, a little bit about some more of the ambiguities in the Deuteronomic history. It's Friday evening where I am, and you're probably wondering, why is he making a video on a Friday night when he could be out having fun? Loser. No, I'm just kidding. But I wanted to finish this up before, because I wanted you guys to see some of the other aspects of the text that probably you would not have seen on your own. So first of all, just to briefly reiterate what we did before, just the kind of the ambiguities about the house, right? This house that David asked for, that God says, sure, go ahead and do. Thanks, but no thanks. Yeah, go ahead and do, but not you, your son. This whole idea of house is, of course, a little bit ambiguous, because house also means kingdom and royal dynasty, and so in some ways the temple and the royal dynasty are both intimately connected. And what's interesting, of course, is that, like with many things, the text is not shy at all about pointing out the inadequacies of the building itself. And this is in 1 Kings chapter 8, when Solomon goes through his lengthy prayer. He says, and I forget the verse exactly, but you can find it, that the temple has no possible way that it could possibly contain the glory of God. God is much, much bigger than the very, very best we could achieve using all our strength and all our wealth and all our might. And so, in some ways, the temple is inadequate. And so it's much like the starting of the kingdom itself. God didn't really want a kingdom. He sort of allowed it, but not without a whole lot of warnings about what it would lead to, mostly bad things. And indeed, even the very best of Israelite institutions, or Judahite institutions, are going to be beset with all of the sort of human failings that Deuteronomy, in effect, the law of Deuteronomy, serves so much to point out. The mixed motives, the divided hearts, the corporate sins, the pride, the jealousy, all of the problems that human beings have, we kind of see, in effect, played out. And the law, in effect, not only brings up these, but it ultimately attaches a curse to them. So we'll really see how it plays out historically in the exile. Now, what about David himself? Now, David himself is a very, very ambiguous figure, especially in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And indeed, if you were to read these, if we had time to spend several weeks on it, I could show you that, in fact, there's a lot of tension within the text about who David is and how his claim to the throne, in effect. There's certainly one idea there being consistently presented, that, yeah, David is God's anointed man. God got tired of Saul and his failures, and basically David and Samuel got together, and Samuel, through his royal sort of ability to convey God's blessings, chose David as the new anointed king. That's true, but there's also this sort of other strange aspect where David really seems in some ways to be usurping Saul and attempting sort of to hasten along history, if you will, to sort of claim the kingdom for himself in ways that are not really easy for the text to, explain away or present in a favorable light. And so I wanted to show you just a few of these as we look at sort of the historical David. So everyone knows about the sin with Bathsheba. That's a pretty famous story, and if you've never read it, I would strongly suggest that you take a look at it. That and the murder afterwards to cover up the adultery with Bathsheba, the murder of Uriah the Hittite. So, but let's take that as read and move on. So if you look real closely at the story of David, there's a little bit of a strange relationship that he has going on with this other kingdom of the Philistines. There's one situation in which he pretends to go crazy. This is chapter 1, verse 1 Samuel chapter 21. He pretends to go crazy, and this is ultimately to kind of escape from the clutches of this king. Yet paradoxically, this king also likes him, and he forms an alliance with this king against Saul and his own people. This is in 1 Samuel 29, chapter 29. And so it's kind of very interesting that David is anointing to take the throne, but yet he's allying with the Philistines against Saul. So what makes that legitimate? Why not just wait for God to in fact instruct him as to when and how the manner of his ascent to the throne would be? Instead, he resorts to in effect partnering with one of God's enemies. Now, at the last minute, the Philistines say, no, we don't want this guy because we think he's going to turn on us. So maybe he's a double agent. We don't know, but the text is very ambiguous. But there's some other things that give us a lot of pause in how David is sort of dealing and double dealing. For one thing, there's all of these alliances and arrangements that he struck with Jonathan. Now, Jonathan is not a figure of insignificance. Jonathan is Saul's own son. And so for David himself, who clearly has designs on the throne himself, to strike a friendship with Jonathan, who also, as the son of Saul, would also clearly be a claimant to the throne should something happen to Saul, this, in some ways, could amount to an act of insurrection. That David's, in effect, plotting with his own son, or in effect, trying to turn his own heir against him, for an eventual overthrow. There's a couple of other things like this that cast David in a morally ambiguous light. If you look at the way he behaves in 1 Samuel 25, he's in effect running a protection racket against this poor guy named Nabal, the Carmelite, where he's in effect extorting cash from him in exchange for not killing him or not destroying him. So this doesn't look too good. There's a couple of other things about David, too, that are very concerning as well. We know about Bathsheba, like I said, but if you look really closely, you'll find in 1 Samuel 14, verse 50, and 1 Samuel 27, verse 3, there's a woman named Ahinoam mentioned. Well, Ahinoam is the wife of Saul, and yet we find out later in 1 Samuel 27, 3, and 2 Samuel 12, 28, that David has taken this Ahinoam for his own wife. Well, there's no better way to usurp the throne for yourself than to claim the king's wife for yourself. The text doesn't explicitly condemn this, but doesn't praise it either. And many scholars really effectively want us to see, or think that the text wants us to see that David is in effect using the wife of Saul, to take Saul's wife away from him, ultimately as a means of a first step to taking the whole kingdom away from him. The same thing with Michal, Saul's daughter. David, if you remember the story, marries Michal, but he never consummates the marriage with her, despite the fact that in 1 Samuel 18, verse 20, she saved his life from her father. And then David, if you go later on to 2 Samuel 6, 16 through 22, David is in effect bragging about his own exploits and conquests of other women before the wife, his own wife, that he's never in fact slept with himself. And so this kind of casts the guy in a little bit of a different light, I think. And so you can see, I think, that the figure of David is rather ambiguous here, and that he's someone, in effect, I think we would be a little bit careful about embracing. Yeah, the text says he's a man after God's own heart, but I sometimes wonder if the text at the same time doesn't want us to see that, yeah, he can be a man after God's own heart in some ways, but a real moral failure in other ways. And so I wanted you to see that, and I also wanted to call attention here to a little bit about the books of Chronicles. Now, again, just like we're going quickly through the Deuteronomic history, we're not having that much time to even really look that closely at the DH. I wanted you, nevertheless, so those of you who are interested, and I know some of you do a lot of outside reading, if you want to see sort of a comparison, and a lot of times you can understand the theology of the biblical books a lot better when you do close comparisons of how given writers within a tradition rework the same story to tell, present it theologically very differently. And there's probably no better way to see that in the Old Testament than the way the chroniclers in 1st, 2nd Chronicles, in effect, retells the story of 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. But this is now written after the Babylonian exile, after the temple's destroyed, the old temple's destroyed, after probably after the new one has been rebuilt, a much more modest one, but there's no king on the throne. And in some ways, what the chronicler is trying to do now is telling the story in the most favorable light that he can, so that he really can turn David much, much more in the Davidic kingdom into much, much more the idealistic figure that we really associate him with, to provide, in effect, a template that we'll see later that the future Messiah figure, who we all know to be Jesus Christ, can step into. Jesus Christ, in some ways, much, much, too big and too good to be merely a figure like the historic David was. There really has to be, in effect, a reinterpretation of David, not only emphasizing his good attributes and, in effect, airbrushing out the bad ones, but really turning him into a figure who in some way represents the whole people. Now, how does the chronicler do this? I'm just going to show you a couple of ways real simply. So the first way is that in the genealogies, one of the things about the Chronicles that's very boring is that there's a very long genealogy at the beginning. If we had time, we could show you some real interesting little tiny tidbits in there. But notice here that the most important thing is that the genealogy goes all the way back to Adam. This is one of the few times the person of Adam is mentioned in the Old Testament at all. And really what the text is attempting to do is connect David to Adam. So in some ways, the connection of Jesus to Adam probably was an idea that started here in the Old Testament with the work of the chronicler, okay, by showing that David in some ways is the heir apparent to whatever God wanted to achieve through Adam. And that's, of course, a much more idealized version of David, because if you remember, Adam was the one who had dominion not over just this tiny little plot of land called Israel, but ultimately over the whole world. And so that's in some way, I think, where we get the ball rolling in terms of understanding what God was doing with Adam, and ultimately what he takes up through the promise of Abraham, and how that becomes not simply a guarantee for a particular part of land, but ultimately for the whole world. We need to do that, we need a much more sort of idealized conception, not only of David, but in some ways an idealized conception of land itself. So there are some interesting things here as well. You see there's a promise version in the chronicler, that's in 1 Chronicles 17, 12 through 14, but there's no chastisement clause. There's nothing about, well, God might come and, take away the throne of David or beat the throne of David if he behaves badly. Now, that's already taken as a given that that's happened in the past. The chronicler wants to focus on the future, this more idealized future which he paints, in which that's not going to happen again. This new reign that we're going to get of this future David figure, which is sort of, the idea, the aspiration in the background, he's going to come and he's not going to need to be chastised like the old David and his successors needed to be. Okay, so going on ahead, one of the most fascinating things in the book of Chronicles is how much the temple itself, and this is of course not the original temple which had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 586, 587 BC. This is now the rebuilt temple, which we'll talk about a little bit more in future weeks. This is after the small community returns home from Babylon. So the chronicler was probably writing at that period of time to address those people and those Israelites. And at this point, what the chronicler really does is do everything possible to connect the temple not to Solomon, as the book of Kings and 2 Samuel did, the Deuteronomic history does, but in the chronicler's history, really the temple's David's. And indeed, it's a much more Davidic stamp. Everything is associated with the temple except the actual building of it. David is the one who pays the price for the temple in 1 Chronicles 21 through 25. Okay, it's a pitiful price that he paid in the 2 Samuel version, 2 Samuel 24:24. You can compare those texts and see for yourself. David procures the materials for the temple in 1 Chronicles 22. He plans out the liturgies. He assigns a division of the labor in the temple. That's in 1 Chronicles 22, 17 through 19. He plans elaborate liturgies, appoints the whole slew of Levites. That's in 1 Chronicles 23. He appoints priests in 1 Chronicles 24, singers in 1 Chronicles 25, gatekeepers of the temple in 1 Chronicles 26, civil and military authorities for the temple in 1 Chronicles 26 and 29 and in 1 Chronicles 27, and clearly instills in Judah the connection of the temple to his everlasting reign, and that's in 1 Chronicles 28, 1 through 10. David is the one in Chronicles who comes up with the building plans and gives them to Solomon. That's in 1 Chronicles 28, 11 and following. Then David gives the temple, in effect, a pre-blessing before his death, 1 Chronicles 29. Now, none of this material appears in the Deuteronomic history at all. Basically, the Deuteronomic history wants to tell us, well, David came up with the original idea, but everything else about the temple was Solomon's. In Chronicles, it's reversed. Solomon did the building, but the building itself is insignificant. Everything about the temple was really David's, and that's really what the chronicler wants us to see. And indeed, not only that, but David is seen as the liturgical guru, the guy who's really combining the idea of liturgical reformer with the idea of king. And so that's another sort of a little interpretive thread that I think we'll see showing up in the New Testament as well. And Jesus Christ, in some ways, is both king, yes, on the one hand, but also liturgical reformer. Jesus Christ gives a new liturgy centered around the new Passover feast, which he celebrates in the Last Supper. More of that later. Okay, it should be noted also that David is the one who first offers sacrifice in the temple. Well, how does he do that when the temple doesn't even exist? Well, if you take a look real carefully in the story of Ornan, the threshing floor of Ornan, where the temple is to be built, that's in 1 Chronicles 22, 1, David is the one who offers sacrifice there. So David is, in effect, the one offered sacrifice on the site of the temple before there ever was a temple. Okay, so again, in the chronicler's version, the temple is really David's, not Solomon's. Okay, so that's kind of cool. The Gibeon story, which sort of casted in First Samuel. It's in 1 Kings 3, where you see the temple being described as, in effect, a substitute for the idolatrous impulses of the king and people. That's gone in the version of 1 and 2 Chronicles. Okay, so basically everything's on Davidic foundations in the Chronicles. Okay, so the chronicler also takes out all of the stuff that I just told you about in terms of David's military exploits, all the wheelings and dealings with the Philistines, the ways in which he deals with Saul, the sin of Bathsheba is gone. All of these things are gone. Okay, all of the things that cast David in a morally ambiguous light are taken out. Okay, and that's of course also by design too, because the chronicler really wants to emphasize not so much the historic David, but the ideal David. Not so much David as he really was, but David in some sense as he ought to have been. I'm not suggesting he's making up stuff out of whole cloth, but he's clearly shaping the story to convey a particular theology. Okay, now David is very interested in liturgy as well. Some of you noted in the comments that David fetches the ark in the Deuteronomic history. That's true. In 1 Samuel 6, 1 through 10, one of you mentioned David dancing when the ark came. Well, of course, that takes all of 10 verses to narrate. It's a fascinating sequence, but what's interesting is that same story takes 1 Chronicles 13, 1 Chronicles 14, 1 Chronicles 15, and even in the beginning of 1 Chronicles 16, over 3 chapters to narrate the fetching of the ark. Why? Because the fetching of the ark is fundamentally, for the chronicler, a liturgical act. And so once again, he's highlighting the degree to which David is a liturgical guru. David is really the guy in charge of the liturgy. David is really... David, we knew from the old Deuteronomic tradition that David is musical, but David's really a liturgical musician here. He really is someone who can plan out the liturgies down to detail with the liturgical music as well. And so this is probably where we get that story as well. What else do I want to tell you? If you compare the reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah in Chronicles, they're much more liturgically informed as well. There's a much greater emphasis on Sabbaths as well. So again, there's a lot of really interesting stuff here in some way you can understand. One advantage of reading 1-2 Chronicles is you actually can understand Deuteronomy a lot better, the Deuteronomic history a lot better. So at any rate, I just wanted you to see briefly some of the basic differences between the Deuteronomic history and the Chronistic history. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to point out too, this is another fascinating thing. In 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, and this is only in Chronicles, this is not found in the Deuteronomic history version anywhere in 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Samuel, but in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, the chronicler tells us that the temple was built not only on the threshing floor of Ornan, that's connected to David and his sacrifice, but Mount Moriah, where Abraham had his aborted sacrifice with Isaac. So in other words, really, this temple is in some ways seen as tightening the threads, going back to David, Abraham, and we've seen the chronicler ultimately at the very beginning take things back to Adam. So there's a lot of salvation history in the books of Chronicles. In some way, I'm almost sorry I didn't have you read it, but there's only so much we can do in an 8-week course, and there's a lot to be learned from the Deuteronomic history too. So, but I want you to see that a lot of the salvation history that we take for granted comes very much out of these stories, both the DH Deuteronomic history and the CH, the chronistic history. So if you get time, read them carefully. Maybe someday we'll have a course just on those things. So anyway, great. I will talk to you later, and I want you to post comments on this video, and I will hope to hear from you tomorrow and the rest of this weekend.